Commander Thixis Valoran stood on the observation deck of his ship and watched the blue planet spinning slowly beneath him. And he felt nothing but boredom mixed with mild irritation at having been assigned to such a simple task. The Valorian Dominion had conquered 200 worlds across the galaxy, and not once had they needed to fire their great weapons or deploy their massive armies in true combat, because every species eventually understood the simple truth that resistance against superior technology was pointless and surrender was the only logical choice. Earth should have been no different. The humans were a young species, barely capable of traveling to their own moon, and their weapons were primitive chemical projectiles that could not even scratch the hull of a Valorian scout ship. So when the Dominion fleet arrived in orbit 6 months ago, Thixis had expected the whole process to take perhaps 2 weeks at most. He had been wrong, and this fact annoyed him greatly. The humans had not surrendered, and they had not accepted their place in the great hierarchy of the Dominion, and instead they had done something that no other species had ever done before. They had simply refused to cooperate in any meaningful way. The major governments had signed the treaties and agreed to the terms, because they had no choice, but the common humans were different, and millions of them had formed what they called resistance cells and had begun causing problems in ways that Thixis found both confusing and exhausting. They sabotaged mining equipment and they spread propaganda, and they refused to work in the labor assignments, and they asked endless questions about rights and freedoms and other concepts that had no place in a properly ordered civilization. This had dealt with rebellion before, but it had always been organized and centralized, and therefore easy to crush. But this human resistance was like trying to grab smoke with his fingers, because every time he thought he had identified the leaders and eliminated them, 10 more would appear from nowhere. His second in command, a younger officer named Kethra, entered the observation deck and stood in attention until Thixis acknowledged him with a wave of his long fingers. Commander, the situation in the northern wilderness zones continues to deteriorate, Kethra reported, his iridescent skin flickering with the colors of concern. More humans are fleeing the integration centers and disappearing into the forests and mountains, and our patrols cannot locate them once they enter the dense vegetation. Thixis turned from the window and fixed his subordinate with a look of cold disdain. Then let them go, he said. If these primitives wish to live like animals in the dirt, that is their choice. And we have more important matters to attend to than chasing every frightened creature into the woods. But Commander, the numbers are significant, and our analysts estimate that nearly 12 million humans have now abandoned the cities and vanished into wilderness areas across the planet. 12 million out of 8 billion is nothing, Thixis replied with a dismissive gesture. The majority of their species has accepted integration, and those who have fled will either return when they grow hungry and cold, or they will die in the wilderness as their weak ancestors did before they built their cities. Kethra hesitated, and Thixis could see that the younger officer wanted to say something more but was afraid to speak. What is it? Thixis demanded. The humans in the wilderness, they are not just hiding, Commander. And our surveillance drones have detected signs of organized activity. Shelters being built, food being gathered and stored, communication networks being established through methods we do not fully understand. Communication networks? They have no technology in those regions. That is correct, Commander. They appear to be using primitive methods. Runners carrying messages, smoke signals, reflected light, bird calls that our analysts believe may be coded language. And we cannot intercept or decode any of it. Thixis laughed. And the sound was harsh and cruel in the quiet of the observation deck. Bird calls? Smoke signals? These are not the tactics of a serious resistance, Lieutenant. These are the desperate measures of a defeated people clinging to the delusion that they can somehow resist the inevitable. And I will not waste resources chasing ghosts through forests. He walked to the communication console and activated the planetary broadcast system, because he had decided that it was time to send a message that would end this foolishness once and for all. Attention, humans of Earth. His voice echoed across every screen and speaker on the planet. I am Commander Thixis Veloran of the Valorian Dominion, and I speak now to those of you who have chosen to flee rather than accept the peace we offer. He paused for effect. Knowing that millions of humans were watching and listening, your ancestors lived as animals once, primitive and afraid, hiding in forests and caves like the beasts they hunted. And if you cannot embrace the civilization we bring, then return to that state, because we will not stop you. His tone became almost gentle, almost merciful, blend with nature, humans, and become invisible, because we will not hunt what does not threaten us. And you may live out your small lives in the wilderness, if that is what you desire. For you are beneath our notice and beneath our concern. He ended the transmission and turned to Kethra with a satisfied expression. There, Lieutenant, I have given them permission to disappear. And now we can focus on the productive portions of their population and forget about these stubborn primitives. Kethra saluted and left the observation deck. But something in his posture suggested that he was not entirely convinced in the weeks that followed. The broadcasts from the wilderness resistance fell silent, and the sabotage in the cities decreased. And the remaining humans in the integration centers became quiet and cooperative. And Thixis congratulated himself on having solved the problem. With words alone, he did not notice that the humans who remained in the cities had begun to smile in a way that made some of his soldiers uncomfortable. He did not notice that the wilderness regions had become completely silent, with no radio signals, no heat signatures, no electromagnetic emissions of any kind. Did not notice that the forests had stopped feeling empty and had started feeling like they were waiting for something 3 weeks after his broadcast. The first Valorian patrol entered the northern forests to establish a resource extraction outpost, and 12 soldiers walked into the trees with confidence and advanced weapons and the absolute certainty that nothing on this primitive planet could threaten them. 3 days later, only 8 of them walked out, and they could not explain what had happened to the other 4, because they had seen nothing and heard nothing. And their comrades had simply been there one moment and gone the next, leaving only small traces of blood on the leaves and the terrible feeling of being watched by something they could not see. Commander Thixis dismissed their reports as the paranoid fantasies of inexperienced soldiers. This was his second mistake. His first mistake had been telling the humans to disappear, because humans, as the galaxy would soon learn, were very good at disappearing, and even better at making others disappear. Lieutenant Kethra had been given command of Outpost 7 North, a resource extraction facility in the dense forests of what the humans once called Canada. And he had accepted the assignment with the pride of a young officer eager to prove himself. The location was perfect for mining operations, with rich deposits of minerals that the Dominion needed for their ships and weapons. And the initial scans had shown no human settlements within 500 kilometers, no heat signatures, no technology, nothing but endless trees and cold rivers and the occasional wild animal. The first week passed without incident, and Kethra began to relax into the routine of managing the mining equipment and supervising the Valorian workers and filing daily reports to Commander Thixis that everything was proceeding according to schedule. On the 8th day, Surveyor Melith went out to check the northern perimeter sensors and did not return. Kethra sent a search team of 4 soldiers to find him, and they walked the entire sensor line twice without discovering any trace of their missing colleague, because there were no footprints leading away from his last known position and no signs of struggle and no blood and no body. It was as if Malith had simply stopped existing. The soldiers reported hearing strange sounds in the forest, soft rustlings that stopped whenever they turned to look, and they described a feeling of being watched by something hidden in the shadows between the trees. But Kethra dismissed this as imagination and stress and ordered them back to work on the 12th day. 3 more Valorians vanished during a routine equipment inspection at the edge of the mining site. And this time, there were traces left behind. A single boot lying in the mud, a communication device crushed and abandoned, and 3 parallel scratches on a tree trunk that looked almost like claw marks but were too regular and too precise to be. Natural Kethra reported the incidents to Commander Thixis and requested additional security personnel. "You are letting the wilderness frighten you, Lieutenant," Thixis replied through the communication screen, his expression showing clear disappointment. "There are no humans in your sector, and the scans confirm this. So whatever is happening must be explained by wildlife or equipment malfunction or simple desertion. Commander, our people do not desert, and no wildlife on this planet could. I will send you 50 additional soldiers," Thixis interrupted. "Use them to secure your perimeter and stop bothering me with ghost stories." The reinforcements arrived 3 days later, and Kethra immediately deployed them in defensive positions around the outpost. But even with the increased numbers, the disappearances continued. Equipment began failing in ways that the technicians could not explain. Power cells drained overnight. Vehicle engines clogged with some kind of sticky plant resin. Communication arrays scrambled by interference that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, and then the traps began. Private Vorath was the first to discover one, though he did not survive the discovery because he stepped onto what looked like solid ground and fell through a layer of branches and leaves into a pit 3 meters deep. And at the bottom of that pit were dozens of sharpened wooden stakes that pierced his body in 17 places. The other soldiers heard his scream and came running. But by the time they reached the pit, Vorath was already dead, and the stakes had been positioned with such precision that every wound was Photokethra stood at the edge of the pit and stared down at the body of his soldier. And he felt something he had never experienced before in his long career. Fear. This was not made by animals, he said quietly to his sergeant. This was constructed, planned, designed to kill. But Lieutenant, our thermal scanners show no humanoid life forms in this entire region, and we would detect any humans long before they could get close enough to build something like this. Then our scanners are wrong, or the humans have found a way to hide from them. Over the following days, more traps were discovered, some through careful searching and others through the deaths of soldiers who triggered them. Tripwires connected to swinging logs studded with sharp stones. Pressure plates that release nets filled with thorny vines. False paths that led to cliff edges hidden by carefully arranged vegetation. Each trap was built entirely from natural materials, wood and stone and plant fiber, and each was invisible to Valorian scanning technology. And each was positioned exactly where a patrol would be most likely to walk. Ithra began to understand that they were not dealing with frightened refugees hiding in the forest. They were dealing with hunters. He sent out a 6-soldier patrol to investigate a cluster of unusual heat signatures 3 kilometers from the base. And they moved through the forest in tight formation with weapons drawn and scanners active. And they found nothing but trees and rocks and a small stream running over smooth stones. They reported no contact, no sightings, no signs of human activity. They returned as 5 Private Yolith had been walking at the rear of the formation, and the soldier in front of him had glanced back to check on him. And Yolith had simply not been there anymore. There was no sound, number struggle, no call for help. One moment he existed, and the next moment he did not. And in the place where he had been standing, there was only a small smear of blood on the leaves and drag marks leading into undergrowth so thick and tangled that no Valorian could follow. The surviving soldiers were shaking when they returned to base, and 2 of them refused to leave the compound again under any circumstances, even when Kethra threatened them with disciplinary action. "There is something in the forest," one of them whispered, his iridescent skin pale with terror. "Something that watches and waits." And it took Yolith without any of us seeing or hearing anything. "And I will not go back out there, Lieutenant. I will not," Kethra reported to Commander Thixis again. And this time his voice was not steady. "Commander, we are under attack by an enemy we cannot see or detect. And we have lost 11 personnel in 2 weeks, and morale is collapsing. And I am formally requesting evacuation." Thixis stared at him through the screen with cold eyes. "Evacuation? Because of some primitive traps and missing soldiers? You will hold that position, Lieutenant, and you will find these humans and eliminate them. Or I will find an officer who can." The communication ended, and Kethra sat alone in his office and listened to the silence of the forest outside. And for the first time he noticed that there were no bird calls, no animal sounds. No insects chirping. The forest was completely and utterly silent, and in that silence, he could feel something watching him, patient and hungry and waiting that night. A soldier on guard duty swore he saw a face in the darkness beyond the fence, a human face covered in mud and leaves, with eyes that reflected the light like an animal's eyes. But when the searchlight swept across the area, there was nothing there, nothing but the trees and the silence and the growing certainty that they were all going to die in this place, far from home, killed by an enemy they would never see. High Arbiter Malvaroon stood before the assembled council of the Valorian Dominion, and for the first time in his 300 years of service, he did not know what to say. The holographic display behind him showed a map of Earth, and the map was covered in red markers indicating abandoned outposts and failed operations and dead soldiers. And the number of those markers had grown so large that some regions of the planet were nothing but solid. Crimson 1 year had passed since Commander Thixis had told the humans to blend with nature, and in that year, the Valorian Dominion had experienced something that had never happened in their entire history of conquest. They were losing, not in the traditional sense, because there had been no great battles and no dramatic confrontations, and no moments where the outcome hung in the balance before tipping one way or the other. Instead, they were losing slowly, steadily, inevitably, like a massive creature being drained of blood by 1,000 tiny wounds. 4,000 Valorian soldiers had died on Earth, killed by traps and ambushes and poisons and accidents that were never quite accidents. And in return, they had confirmed the deaths of only 17 humans, 4,000 to 17. The mathematics were impossible, and yet they were real. "We cannot continue this occupation," Malvaroon said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of defeat. "The humans have developed a form of warfare that we cannot counter, and every soldier we send to fight them simply becomes another casualty. Then we destroy them from orbit," said Admiral Kethras, his iridescent skin flushing with anger. "We burn their forests and poison their waters and make their planet uninhabitable, and we watch them die." "We have tried orbital strikes," Malvaroon replied. "We have tried chemical weapons and biological agents and targeted bombardment of every kind. And none of it has worked because we cannot target what we cannot find. And the humans have learned to hide so effectively that our most advanced sensors cannot detect them. Then we destroy everything, targeted or not. If we destroy Earth's biosphere, we destroy the resources we came to harvest, and the operation becomes pointless. And we will have killed 4,000 soldiers for nothing." The council chamber fell silent, and Malvaroon could see the same terrible realization spreading across every face. They had no answer, no strategy, no path to victory. A junior analyst named Theris Velmuth rose from her seat in the back of the chamber. And she spoke with the trembling voice of someone who knew she was about to say something that her superiors did not want to hear. "High Arbiter, I have been studying human history, and I believe I understand their strategy." "Then explain it," Male Varun said, gesturing for her to continue. "The humans are not trying to win quickly, and they are not trying to win at all in any way that we understand victory." Theris moved to the holographic display and pulled up records from Earth's ancient past. Their ancestors had a saying: "If you wait by the river long enough, the bodies of your enemies will float by." They are practicing what they call a war of attrition, a conflict designed not to defeat us in battle, but to exhaust us over time, to make the cost of occupation so high that we eventually decide to leave. They do not need to kill all of us, and they do not need to destroy our technology or capture our bases. They only need to keep fighting, keep hiding, keep bleeding us one soldier at a time, until we conclude that this planet is not worth the price we are paying. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was quiet but certain. "They can do this forever. High Arbiter, we cannot." The council debated for 3 more days, arguing over tactics and strategies and alternative approaches. But in the end, they all knew that Theris was right. And the only question was how long they would continue to lose soldiers before they accepted the truth. The evacuation order was issued on a cold morning in what the humans called November, and the Valorian fleet began the slow process of withdrawing from Earth's orbit as the ships broke away from the planet. Something strange appeared on their long-range sensors. Heat signatures, millions of them, emerging from forests and mountains and swamps and caves all across the globe. The humans had been there all along, hidden in places the Valorians had scanned 1,000 times. And now they were revealing themselves, stepping out of their concealment to watch their enemy retreat. A transmission reached the flagship, broadcast from 100,000 sources simultaneously. A chorus of human voices speaking in unified defiance. "We blended with nature. As you commanded, nature was always ours. This is our world, our home, our territory, and you were never anything more than trespassers. Come back when you are ready to ask permission." The transmission ended, and the Valorian fleet engaged their jump drives and fled into the darkness between stars, leaving behind a planet that had defeated them without ever fighting a single conventional battle. High Arbiter Male Varun spent the long journey home composing the official report, and he struggled to find words that would explain to future generations how the greatest military power in the galaxy had been defeated by creatures who fought with wooden spears and stone-tipped arrows, and the patience of predators who had been hunting since before the Valorians achieved spaceflight in the end. He wrote only a single entry for the Dominion's official record: ZARTH status, quarantine threat level, existential recommended action, absolute avoidance notes. Do not engage, do not negotiate, do not land, because the humans have not forgotten and will never forget. And the forests are still watching 50 years later. The story of Earth had become legend among the conquered species of the Dominion, a tale whispered in secret gatherings and passed down from generation to generation. They spoke of a world where the forests themselves seemed to come alive and hunt the invaders, where shadows had teeth and the silence was more dangerous than any weapon, where a species so primitive that they had barely reached their own moon had somehow driven away an empire that spanned 1,000 stars. They spoke of the humans who had disappeared into the wild and become something more than human, something ancient and patient and utterly merciless. And in the great archives of the Dominion, a new proverb circulated among those conquered peoples who dreamed of someday following humanity's example: never tell a human to disappear. They are better at it than you can imagine, and what vanishes into the dark does not always stay hidden on Earth. The forests grew thick and green, and the humans rebuilt their civilization in harmony with the wild places that had saved them. And they never forgot the lesson they had taught the galaxy. They were not the most advanced species, and they were Not the strongest or the fastest or the most technologically powerful, but they were patient. And they were clever. And they were absolutely unwilling to surrender. And sometimes, that was enough. Sometimes, the predator at the top of the food chain was not the one with the biggest teeth or the sharpest claws. Sometimes, it was the one who could disappear into the shadows and wait, and strike without warning and vanish again before the prey even knew what had happened. Valorians had learned this lesson at the cost of 4,000 lives and an entire planet. The rest of the galaxy learned it from their example, and humans continued to watch the stars, patient and silent and ready, because they knew that someday another empire might make the same mistake, might underestimate the species that had spent millions of years becoming the most dangerous hunters their world had ever known. When that day came, the forests would be waiting, the humans would be waiting, and the lesson would be taught again. Senior analyst Morath Vos Shen had spent 40 years studying alien species for the Dominion, and she had developed profiles on hundreds of different civilizations. And she had never encountered anything like what was happening on Earth. The reports flooding into Valorian High Command were impossible. And yet they kept coming from every corner of the planet: the Amazon Basin, the Siberian forest, the Congo jungle, the mountain ranges of what humans called Appalachia, and dozens of other wilderness regions across the globe. The pattern was always the same. First, the humans in a region would disappear, abandoning their cities and towns and villages and melting into the wild lands as if they had never existed. And all attempts to track them would fail because they left no heat signatures and no electromagnetic signals and no technological footprint of any kind. Then the silence would begin. That terrible quiet that soldiers had started calling the waiting, because it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath, watching and listening and preparing for something terrible. Then the deaths would start. Morath spread the casualty reports across her desk and tried to find some logic in the numbers. But the data defied every model she had ever built in the Amazon. An entire survey team of 23 Valorians had vanished in a single night, and the rescue parties sent to find them had discovered nothing but empty tents and cold campfires and strange symbols painted on the trees in what later analysis confirmed was Valorian blood in Siberia. A mining operation had been abandoned after the workers reported that their tools kept disappearing and their food kept spoiling and their generators kept failing. And on the final night before evacuation, someone had written words in the snow outside every building: "We see you in the Congo." Soldiers had started refusing to patrol after 3 consecutive squads had walked into the jungle and never returned. And the screams that echoed from the trees at night made sleep impossible for everyone in the outpost. Commander Thixis had responded to the crisis by deploying advanced surveillance technology, thermal imaging satellites, motion detection drones, seismic sensors that could detect footsteps from a kilometer away. None of it worked. The thermal satellites showed nothing because the humans had learned to mask their body heat by covering themselves in mud and cold river water, and by sleeping in underground shelters that blocked their heat signatures from above. Motion detection drones fell from the sky one by one, disabled by rocks and primitive slingshots and other projectile weapons that the automated systems dismissed as harmless wildlife activity. The seismic sensors detected thousands of small vibrations, but could not distinguish human footsteps from the movements of deer and wolves and other animals that the humans had learned to imitate with perfect accuracy. Morath requested access to the Dominion's archives on human history, because she needed to understand how a species with such primitive technology could possibly be doing this. And what she found in those archives made her blood run cold. Humans were not new to this kind of warfare for thousands of years, long before they developed electricity or combustion engines or any of the technologies that the Valorians considered necessary for civilization. Humans had been the most successful hunters on their planet They had driven the great mammoths to extinction, not through superior weapons, but through patience and coordination and the ability to track their prey across vast distances without rest. They had hunted lions and tigers and bears, creatures with claws and fangs and strength far beyond anything a human body could match. And they had won those battles through cunning and traps, and the simple refusal to give up. They had developed something called persistence. Hunting, a technique where human hunters would chase their prey for hours or even days, never fast enough to catch it, but never stopping, never resting, until the animal collapsed from exhaustion and could be killed with simple weapons. And they had perfected the art of camouflage and concealment, learning to blend with their environments so completely that they could approach within arm's reach of their prey without being detected. Morith compiled her findings into a report and sent it to Commander Thixis with an urgent classification. The humans have not become primitive, she wrote. They have chosen to appear primitive because they understand that our technology cannot detect what it is not designed to look for. They are using knowledge that has been passed down through hundreds of generations, techniques that were developed over 10,000 years of hunting the most dangerous animals on their planet. And they are applying those techniques to us. We are not dealing with refugees or rebels or desperate survivors clinging to hope. We are dealing with predators who have decided that we are their prey. Thixis dismissed her report as academic nonsense and ordered increased military presence in all affected regions. Morith tried to warn him that more soldiers would simply mean more targets, but he refused to listen, because he could not accept the idea that a species so technologically inferior could possibly pose a genuine threat to the Valorian dominion. In the weeks that followed, the death toll continued to rise. Soldiers sent to reinforce struggling outposts arrived to find those outposts already abandoned, with nothing left behind but empty buildings and ominous messages carved into the walls. Patrol routes that had been considered safe suddenly became death traps, as the humans seemed to know exactly where the Valorians would be and when they would be there. Supply convoys were ambushed by enemies that appeared from nowhere and vanished before anyone could return fire, leaving behind wrecked vehicles and missing supplies and traumatized survivors who spoke of shadows that moved like smoke and struck like lightning. And through it all, the humans remained invisible, undetectable, impossible to find or fight or even understand. Morith continued her research, desperate to find some weakness in the human strategy. And she discovered something that filled her with a new kind of fear. The humans were not just hiding and attacking, they were communicating across thousands of kilometers, through forests and mountains and swamps. The scattered human groups were coordinating their actions with perfect precision, sharing information about Valorian patrol patterns and outpost weaknesses and the best methods for killing the invaders. They were doing this without any technology that the Dominion could detect, using methods so simple and so ancient that Valorian scanning equipment could not even recognize them as communication. Smoke signals that looked like natural fires, patterns of reflected sunlight that seemed like random glare, bird calls that carried coded messages across vast distances. The humans had built an invisible network that connected every resistance fighter on the planet, and they were using it to wage a war that the Valorians did not even know how to fight. Morith added a final note to her report, a warning that she hoped someone would take seriously. We told them to blend with nature, she wrote, and they obeyed, and now we cannot find them, and we cannot fight them, and we cannot stop them. The forests are no longer empty. The forests are full of humans who have become invisible, and they are hunting us, and they will not stop until we leave or we die. No one at high command read her warning. They were too busy counting their dead. Commander Thixis Valorn had decided to take personal command of Outpost 7 North, because he refused to believe that primitive humans could defeat Valorian soldiers. and he was determined to prove that the reports of invisible enemies and impossible traps were nothing but the fantasies of cowardly officers. Arrived with 200 of his best troops, heavily armed and equipped with the most advanced scanning technology the Dominion possessed. And he immediately ordered aggressive patrols into the surrounding forest to find and eliminate the human threat once and for all. The patrols found nothing day after day. His soldiers marched into the trees and searched every shadow and scanned every square meter of ground. And they returned with nothing to report except the same terrible silence that had driven the previous garrison to the edge of madness. Thixus grew frustrated, and frustration made him reckless. He ordered the forest burned. The flames spread quickly at first, consuming the dry underbrush and sending pillars of smoke into the sky. But by midnight, the fires had died, smothered by something that the soldiers could not explain. And in the morning, the forest looked exactly as it had before. Untouched and silent and waiting. Thixus ordered chemical defoliants deployed to kill the vegetation and expose whatever was hiding beneath it. But when the technicians went to prepare the chemicals, they found that the storage tanks had been drained through tiny holes that no one had noticed, and the precious defoliants had soaked uselessly into the ground. He requested orbital bombardment, demanding that High Command burn the entire region from space. But the targeting satellites could find nothing to aim at, because the thermal imaging showed only trees and animals and empty forest floor. Humans were there. Thixus knew they were there, but they had become invisible in a way that defied everything the Dominion understood about detection and surveillance. Then the messages began to appear every morning. The sentries would discover something new outside the compound walls. Stones arranged in strange patterns, symbols carved into trees, small figures made of twisted branches and dried grass that seemed to represent Valorian soldiers. The base linguists could not decode the symbols, but that was not their purpose, because Thixus understood that the messages were not meant to communicate information. They were meant to communicate fear. The humans wanted the Valorians to know that they were being watched constantly and from every direction by enemies who could come within meters of the compound without being detected. Psychological effect on the troops was devastating. Soldiers began reporting nightmares about shadows that reached for them with cold hands, and the base medical officer documented a surge in anxiety disorders and sleep deprivation and paranoid delusions. Guards on night duty swore they heard footsteps circling the perimeter, footsteps that stopped whenever searchlights swept the area and resumed the moment the lights moved on. Two soldiers had to be restrained after they began firing their weapons at nothing, screaming that they could see faces in the darkness, human faces covered in mud and leaves with eyes that glowed like the eyes of hunting animals. Thixus ordered increased rations of calming medication, but the compound's medical supplies began to disappear, stolen by someone or something that could enter the secure storage areas without triggering any alarms. Then the poisoning started. The first case was a soldier who collapsed during morning assembly, his body racked with convulsions, and the medical officer determined that his breakfast had been contaminated with toxins from local plants. The second case was a group of 6 soldiers who became violently ill after drinking from the compound's water supply, which had been tainted with something that the Valorian equipment could not identify. No one died from the poisonings, and Thixus eventually realized that death was not the intention, because weak and sick soldiers were more of a burden than dead ones, and the humans were systematically degrading the garrison's effectiveness without engaging in direct combat. Stopped sleeping. He spent his nights pacing the compound, watching the darkness beyond the fences, straining to see the enemies he knew were there, and every shadow seemed to move when he was not looking directly at it, and every rustle of leaves sounded like approaching footsteps. On the 23rd night, he woke from a brief untroubled sleep to find something on his pillow It was a small wooden figure, crudely carved but unmistakably shaped like a Valorian. With a tiny noose made of plant fiber around its neck, Thixis stared at the figure for a long time, his hands trembling, and he understood that a human had been in his room while he slept. Close enough to touch him, close enough to kill him. And had chosen instead to leave a warning. He called for his guards. And they came running, but they had heard nothing and seen nothing. And the security recording showed only empty corridors and locked doors. The humans were inside the walls. They were everywhere and nowhere. Invisible and patient, and they were playing with him the way a predator plays with wounded prey. Thixis finally issued the evacuation order. But escape was no longer possible. The access roads had been blocked by fallen trees. Dozens of them. All collapsed in the same night, without anyone hearing the sound of cutting or crashing. The landing pads had been cratered by hidden pits that appeared overnight, making shuttle landings impossible. The emergency spacecraft, kept in a secure hangar with guards posted at every entrance, was missing 3 critical engine components that had been there during the previous inspection. They were trapped. Thixis sent a desperate distress signal to High Command, begging for rescue, and for a moment he heard the voice of the communications officer at headquarters, beginning to respond. Then the signal dissolved into static, and through the static came a different voice, calm and cold and speaking flawless Valorian with a slight human accent. "You told us to become invisible, Commander." Thixis felt his blood turn to ice in his veins. "You told us to disappear, to blend with nature, to become like the animals our ancestors hunted." The voice paused, and when it continued, there was something almost like amusement in its tone. "Did you think that was a threat, Commander? Did you think you were sending us into exile? That was a gift. You gave us permission to become what we were always meant to be. And now you will learn what the deer learned, what the mammoth learned, what every creature on this planet learned over millions of years. When humans disappear into the wild, it is not because we are hiding, it is because we are hunting." The transmission ended, and the lights in the compound went dark. And in the sudden blackness, Thixis heard sounds that would haunt him for the rest of his short life. Soft footsteps on the compound floor, whispered words in a language he did not understand, and the screams of his soldiers, as shadows that had been waiting for so long finally decided to strike. Not all of them died that night. Some were allowed to escape, to carry the story back to High Command, to spread the fear that was now the humans' greatest weapon. Thixis was among the survivors, though he wished he was not, because living with the memory of what he had seen in the darkness was worse than any death. The humans had shown him what they truly were. He would never stop being afraid.